The short reading of Mark's Passion began with a transitional paragraph. On the previous night, the chief priests called the Sanhedrin together. This council governed the Jewish faith and many of the internal affairs of Jerusalem. They came together to put Jesus on trial. It was a joke. They knew they wanted to condemn him to death, so the chief priest asked him if he were the Christ. In Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus replied, "I am." That was blasphemy to their ears, and that's all they wanted to hear. They beat him, bound him, and took him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect, to finish off the sentence. Pilate wasn't interested in the theological matters of Jewish faith. He was focused on politics. So he asked the political question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This was the title the Romans gave to Herod when they set him up to be a puppet king in Judea. So they really wanted to know if Jesus had any ambitions for Herod's throne, the judgment seat upon which Pilate would soon sit. Notice the difference between the question the chief priest asked and the one Pilate asked. One asked, "Are you the Christ?" The other one asked, "Are you a pretender to the throne of King Herod?" In Mark's Gospel, Jesus gave a straightforward answer to the first. Yes, he was the Christ. But to the second, he flipped the answer back upon Pilate. He said, "That's what you say." Then he became silent to the accusation of the leaders who wanted to kill him. This was his last chance to clear his name, a way to talk himself out of charges. But he said nothing. Pilate was surprised at his lack of defense. The custom of releasing a prisoner for Passover can only be found in the Gospels. No other historical source mentions such a phrase. Nonetheless, this led to the introduction of Barabbas, a man whose name meant Son of the Father. While the name could be found in later Jewish writings, during the time of Jesus it was rare. So, what could the name refer to? And who was the father of this man? Symbolically, the father of this man and all people was Adam, the first man to sin. Theologically, he and everyone else were descendants of the sinner. They all shared in his proclivity to sin. In the gospel, Barabbas represents all of us sinners. The stage was set for a tussle between Pilate and the religious leaders. Jesus and Barabbas were only pawns in their fight. Pilate knew the reason they wanted Jesus dead was out of envy. They were jealous of his sway among the people, but they also feared he might upset their place of authority. So they played the game, Jesus, the king of the Jews, on one side with Pilate, Barabbas with the religious leaders and the mob on the other. But notice the deeper issue. The sinner, Barabbas, the son of Adam, was freed. In his place was Jesus, the man Pilate asked the crowd, "What evil deed did he do?" He was the one whose blood the mob demanded. He was the innocent man who suffered and died in place of the guilty. He endured the passion so that every Barabbas, all of us, could be freed from our transgressions. The soldiers taunted Jesus with a mock court. To humiliate him, they dressed him up as King of the Jews, with a purple cloak and a crown of thorns. They kept beating him on the head with a stiff reed and continually spat at him. They sarcastically knelt before him and welcomed him to his new station as the regent. Notice the political title they addressed him, not the theological one. This was all calculated to shame him, to prepare him psychologically for his death. Simon the Cyrene suddenly appeared on the scene. Since Roman law allowed a soldier to press a commoner into service for 1 mile, the soldiers had him carry the cross of Jesus. The mention of his sons provided an interesting tidbit of historical data. Some scholars speculate that Alexander and Rufus were disciples known to Mark's community. Through the witness of their father's memory, we could have evidence of a first-hand account of the death of Jesus. This passage gave the time, place, and process of the crucifixion. Note they offered Jesus wine mixed with a drug to dull his reflexes and ease their job in the execution. But he refused. Then they gambled for his clothing, the spoils of their task. Again, the political title appeared on the placard with the charge, King of the Jews. In this section, the scene was set for public shame. After the 2 robbers were crucified, the mockery began. Imagine those insulting Jesus in 3 concentric circles. On the outside were the people, in the middle were the religious leaders, on the inside were the condemned robbers. The people repeated the charge made at the trial before the Sanhedrin, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it. They taunted him with a sign he supposedly claimed to profess. The religious leaders replaced that alleged sign with the title he laid claim to, Messiah, King of Israel. Notice again this was the theological title of rule over the people, not a claim to a temporal throne. Finally, the robbers chimed in. At this point, Jesus was totally rejected. This passage contained a call and response. The call was the line of Jesus, my God, why have you abandoned me?" The response was the speculation about the appearance of Elijah. How are these two connected? The cry of Jesus came from Psalm 2, verse 22. The first full line of the psalm began with the rejection, but the rest of the psalm ended with salvation. 3 quarters through, it shifted from a prayer of deliverance to one of praise. In other words, he shouted this line to remind his opponents of the psalm and its spirit of hope. He looked defeated now, but he would end up victorious. In response, those around him wondered if Elijah would appear. In 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 18, the great prophet did not die, but was swept into heaven upon a fiery chariot. In Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 through 6, the author prophesied the return of Elijah before the day of judgment. Those who saw the countryside covered with darkness and heard the call of the Lord might have wondered if the end times were upon them. Would the prophet come? Would he come to save Jesus from the cross? The man who offered Jesus wine gave it with that question in mind. The Lord called out, not in despair, but in hope. The crowd wondered if God would send Elijah to fulfill that desire and usher in the end times. Finally, the end came. Jesus breathed out and died. In the temple, the place where Jews believed God dwelt, the curtain ripped from top to bottom as if Yahweh himself rent his robes in horror, just as the high priest did when he heard Jesus declare that he was the Christ. This was the time of shock, but it was also the time of faith. When the centurion in charge of the execution saw him die, he declared, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." The crucifix, then, was the sign that led him and the rest of us to God.